I remember as a kid hearing about Jimmy Hoffa. He was the president of the Teamsters, he was a gangster, and he had huge beef with Robert Kennedy and the Justice Department. And there was a war going on with Jimmy Hoffa, and he disappeared in 1975, never to be seen again. And where his body is has been one of the biggest mysteries of my lifetime.
Biggest mystery, where is it? And when I ended up doing some consultation with the FBI, I had a friend of mine that was actually deep inside the mob during those years when he turned up missing. And he said, well, the rumor is he was at the end zone of one of these stadiums, that's where his body was buried. And there's been all these different theories about where he's been buried. And the latest one is a deathbed confession by a person who allegedly was involved in his murder, a corrupt cop who was working for the mob, Walters, who had a playing card, the Ace of Spades, where he had written down where his body was presumably moved.
That's the playing card. This is courtesy of the case breakers.
You know, a lot of people want attention regarding this case because of the nature of the case. And so I think that from a purely investigative standpoint, the first thing I would do is see if I can trace back to where those cards were made and where they were in Vegas. I would look at, okay, if this was this Walters card, is his DNA on it? I would do a handwriting sample. I would take a look and take it to an expert and find out whether or not this really would have been his handwriting.
So let's just deconstruct it. So it says, if you connect the dots here, that maybe the body is on the third base at the Milwaukee ballpark.
The claim was that this man that had this card, Walter, he had a place near the Canadian border where supposedly Hoffa's body was buried after he was murdered. Then for some reason, 20 years later, they're moving the body to put it in a more public place, buried at the third base before they reconstructed this park.
Which objectively makes no sense, right? I mean,
well, but remember, this is before surveillance cameras.
But still, why?
You got to transport that body from Canada to Milwaukee.
Going back to the Kennedys, there's another credible theory that Jimmy Hoffa actually turned informant. And there is a theory that he was set to testify regarding his potential involvement and maybe the mob's in the Kennedy's assassination.
Wait a minute, which Kennedy?
Robert.
Robert Kennedy was at the top of his list.
Do you have any indication that what you have in the past termed harassment by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, that this is letting up or changing in any manner?
It is increasing in tempo.
But I had never heard Hoffa was involved in Robert Kennedy. By the way, I was at the Ambassador Hotel that night.
Oh, wow. Why?
As a kid, I was the head of Students for Kennedy.
Well, didn't they do ground penetrating radar underneath the space and they found some kind of weird anomaly?
That is the exact thing that gives it credence, because the likelihood of this randomized note on this card, this scavenger hunt, this map, if you will, leading to something that is actually in the ground seems so improbable.
Right, but you got to watch ground penetrating radar. It's really basic, just so you know. It does show that there might be a void or this kind of thing in the ground, but it doesn't show like if there's a skeleton.
But it's not even just radar. It's also cadaver dogs that are signaling there were human remains buried under there, which could be nothing, but again, the likelihood that on this old third base.
It's definitely worth a look. It's definitely worth
Absolutely.
Here's the map of this stadium, which, by the way, it was reconstructed.
The parking lot now.
That's where third base used to be, in the red. So that's where they say the body is. Why don't they just dig under that?
That's the only thing I don't understand. Even though I don't think it's likely, I think at least just cross that off, check that box, right? What we do know is that on the day of his disappearance, he had lunch plans with two other mobsters, and their names were Provenzano and Giacalone, and they never showed up. And we know they never showed up because Hoffa placed two calls, one to his wife bitching about the fact that he felt that he'd been stood up, and then he called somebody at the office or somewhere saying that, they're late. And then there is a witness that saw Hoffa get into a car with a single person.
The theory goes the Genovese crime family put the hit out. They gave the contract to Provenzano and Tony Jack. He went by Tony Jack. And they were supposed to meet Hoffa at this restaurant, which, by the way, this is my uncle and Jimmy Hoffa.
Oh.
My great uncle Eddie and Jimmy Hoffa were friends. My great uncle Eddie was the VP of the LA chapter of the Teamsters Union.
Was he in the mob?
What's funny is his brother, my grandfather, was a cop, was like one time quoted as saying like, "You're such a gangster," and he's like, "You're such a cop."
The problem is this guy had so many enemies. That's the real problem to this case, is because you have theories that federal agents pushed him out of a plane into the lake. At least 4 hitmen for the mob who've either been affiliated or admitted that they did it. It can't all be true. I hope that I don't have that many enemies. If I am murdered, that, you know, like it's a very short list.
Oh, but there is a list.